Happy New Year, Flutter devs. It's time for a channel update. Let's start by recapping 2020, and then let's talk about SuperDeclarative in 2021. So for those of you who have been following me since early to mid 2020, you probably know where I came from and what my story is here, but for those of you who don't know, let me quickly recap. I was a Google developer for about 5 years. I was a member of the Flutter team at Google for about 2 years. And then in February of 2020, I left Google, I left the Flutter team, ironically, to actually work harder on all things Flutter. When I was within the team, I could work on building Flutter. I could create features, write the code, contribute to the project. But I reached a point where I felt like the project is kind of on autopilot in a lot of ways, and the people there on the team, frankly, they're better suited to build that project than me. But one place that wasn't so well handled or projected, or something that was still a risk, let's put it that way, something that was still a risk, was the world of education. Flutter education. How do you learn to become a Flutter developer? And how do you write Flutter code effectively in the workplace for production apps? Because I have this fear that because Flutter makes so many things so easy, developers that are early in their career, they'll choose Flutter because it's the most accessible technology for them. Like, imagine you're 1 year, 2 years into programming, and your choice is between Flutter or some kind of C++ system. I mean, it's not even close. Flutter is way easier. But then what happens if a bunch of relatively inexperienced developers flood into the world of Flutter? They start contributing a bunch of production code, and because they're inexperienced, because they don't know what to value in the software development process, they write a bunch of garbage code. And what happens if the world accumulates a bunch of spaghetti code written in Flutter? What happens when the managers and the directors and the CTOs start looking around and realize that all their Flutter code is garbage? Well, then the obvious thing that's going to happen next is that they blame Flutter. And it's not really Flutter's fault. But if that happens, and if they blame Flutter, then all of those decision makers decide to no longer use Flutter, and then those of us who so happily build Flutter apps will be out of a job. And I didn't want that to happen. I don't want that to happen. So I decided to leave the Flutter team and focus on Flutter education and corporate training, Flutter evangelism in general. I want to show the world why Flutter matters, why they should use Flutter, why most apps should be based on Flutter from a UI perspective, and then help everybody get there. That's the goal. Help the world adopt Flutter. That was my thinking in early 2020 when I left the Flutter team. And when I left the Flutter team, I put out a video and I made some promises about what I was going to deliver in 2020. And like most people's 2020, it did not go quite as planned. So I did manage to deliver a bunch of widget workshop videos. Those are all visible on this channel. Many of you have already watched many of those videos. Widget workshops are live coding exercises where I show you how to create some kind of visual effect or widget in the span of 30 minutes, an hour, hour and a half, that kind of thing. I was also able to deliver corporate training. I trained a handful of teams to get them started with Flutter. So they're off to the races. I hope they're all doing well. If any of you watching were on those teams, I hope everything's going well still with Flutter. I hope you're implementing all your features and finding that Flutter is the right solution for you. I was able to do that in 2020, but some things that I wanted to do that I didn't get around to doing is that I never produced another Flutter challenge. I wanted to bring those back in 2020 to some degree, never did. I wanted to start a podcast in 2020, never got around to it. I wanted to publish a book in 2020, never got around to it. And of course, I talked a lot about delivering courses. And while I did deliver a few small paid videos, premium videos, I did not get around to delivering the Flutter Foundations courses that I wanted to. And so this video, this conversation that we're having here, is where I kind of look at where I'm going from here, what I expect to happen, and to make it clear why that's what I expect to happen. And so we can have a shared vision for SuperDeclarative moving forward. Now, I view my business the way many other businesses do, which is in terms of quarters. I might think annually, I might think about the year 2021, but I break it up into quarters, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, and I try to optimize each quarter. So I say, this quarter, for the next 3 months, what are my priorities? Because beyond that, it's really difficult to control and predict, especially when you're a one-man business like I am. So I'd like to talk to you about my plans for Q1, quarter one of 2021, to give you an idea of what I'll be doing, what I expect to do, and therefore also what I probably won't be doing. For me, quarter one, Q1 of 2021 is actually going to be mostly contract work. I spent most of 2020 losing money, and so I need to start 2021 by recouping some of that and actually having some kind of financial integrity. A lot of my time last year was spent either producing the free videos that I published or building some of the websites and some of the platforms that I use for other things. In 2021, I need to start by really monetizing my development work. So I already have a few contracts that are in the works. I need to deliver those in Q1. That's going to provide a good portion of my revenue, probably for the year. And then I can focus a little more after that on open source development, on free video content, and even on some other paid offerings that require more groundwork. But just because I'm going to be doing a lot of contract work in Q1 does not mean that this channel won't have videos on it. I'm still going to be publishing things, and I'm going to talk to you in a moment about what those are and why. So I'm not going anywhere, but you may see a bit less of me over the next few months than you have in the last few months. So there are two major things that I want to focus on in 2021. In 2020, I was primarily focused on trying to build an audience. And actually, let me talk about that for a minute, because here's what I was thinking going into 2020, just so you all know. My goal was to begin putting out videos that would build an audience large enough to actually impact Flutter adoption. What does that mean? There are hundreds of thousands, millions of developers around the world that could be using Flutter that are not currently using Flutter. My goal is to eventually reach all of those developers, show them why they should use Flutter, and then show them how. In my mind, there were three ideal steps to this. Step number one, begin producing compelling content that would attract them to the channel. Step two is to continue that until I aggregated, ideally, a couple 100,000 views per video, about 20,000 plus subscribers. And then step three, teach that group how to adopt Flutter in addition to those free videos, by then offering paid courses. And those paid courses would then fund my ability to make more free videos to attract more developers to sell more tools to adopt Flutter. That was the business model that I was hoping. It turns out those numbers were ridiculously wrong. Now, those numbers were based on my own personal experiences in 2018. In 2018, I was putting out videos. I was getting a couple 100,000 views per video, and without even trying, I racked up about 20,000 subscribers. My hope was that I could do it again in 2020. The reality is that the world has changed with regard to Flutter over the past 2 years. Change number one is that there are dozens of channels on YouTube creating videos like the videos that I create. I'd like to think I have a pretty high quality offering in that area, but nonetheless, a bunch of people are out there recording these kinds of videos, so the supply is way up. At the same time, a lot of developers have seen these things now. They've seen what Flutter can do. They're not shocked or surprised anymore, and therefore the hype has gone down. Now, it's fine that the hype has gone down. Hype is not what drives substantial industry change. That was always going to happen. Hype always goes in a curve. It goes way up, and then it goes way down, and then it comes back a little bit, and then it evens out to whatever that final amount is going to be, that final level of interest. That is literally the hype curve. So that's fine. But what that means is that instead of accumulating 20,000 subscribers, I accumulated less than 2,000 subscribers. And even worse, instead of having a couple 100,000 views per video, I'm currently seeing less than 1,000 on average over the first, few weeks of releasing a video. And these numbers are just unworkable. If my goal is to truly help the world adopt Flutter, I can't just reach 2,000 people. Now, I appreciate every one of you that tunes in, every one of you that subscribes, every one of you that comments. I'm glad you're here. It's just that to accomplish the goal, if we really are going to move the world to Flutter for the betterment of everyone, in my opinion, if we're going to accomplish that, I've got to find a way to reach hundreds of thousands of people. And what I've learned in 2020 is that these live coding exercises simply aren't going to do it. It doesn't drive the attention or the interest or the engagement or the subscribers, the view counts, any of it. If I can't reach people, I can't convince them. If I can't reach people, I can't sell them the tools to adopt Flutter, which then allows me to continue working in the education space. So something has to change, and that leads us into 2021 and some shifts in my focus. So here's what I'm looking at in 2020. Obviously, everything is still Flutter-based. My entire purpose for being here is based on Flutter. That's never going to change. But how I go about doing what I do, that might change a little bit. Now, let me tell you real quick one thing you definitely will get this year, just because I already have the content in the works, is that I have 2 Flutter challenges that are in the process of being developed. So in 2021, you will at least get a couple Flutter challenges. They're going to feel a lot like widget workshops. They're both based on requests from a couple of you out there in the SuperDeclarative fan base. And 2, they kind of, instead of just creating some visual effect, they try to go solve a rather specific problem, a complexity that someone didn't know how to deal with. So I go and I show you, okay, here's how we're going to solve this. You'll get at least 2 of those in 2021. But from there, I'm thinking about introducing a podcast. Now, I mentioned that in 2020. I never got around to it. But I think it's probably time to experiment with that, because I know that the live coding isn't really cutting it. That's not driving the interest. So maybe deeper conversations about Flutter topics would be useful, would be interesting. Maybe some interviews would be interesting. I'm thinking of a podcast similar to the Fragmented podcast, for those of you that come from the Android world. Or, I guess really similar to any kind of formal podcast, where some episodes would be conversations like this, where I'm talking to you about my ideas. Maybe I do an episode where I tell you my story of how I discovered Flutter and how I got involved with it. Maybe I do an episode where I talk to you about state management and why it doesn't really exist and why we should stop arguing about it. And I could do an episode where I talk to you about testing and how I think about testing and how I approach it. But then also I could interview some members of the Flutter community, talk to them about how they got involved with Flutter, what they're doing with Flutter, what is important to them, where do you think we are wasting our time as a community? And if the Flutter team would like to send some people to that podcast, I could interview them as well. Obviously, I have existing relationships with a number of them. But let me know your thoughts on this. For those of you who have subscribed for months, for those of you who have been watching the videos, is a podcast even on your list of things that would be more engaging and more interesting for you? Or is there some other video format, some other kind of content that you think is more valuable to you, would be more valuable to those who, for whatever reason, haven't tried Flutter yet? How can we, and let's make it about us. It's not just me, it's us. It's our community here. how can we reach the broader developer community? You let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Now, beyond the podcast, so you're going to get a couple of Flutter challenges. Ideally, you're going to get a podcast, and probably the podcast we're looking at late Q1, because again, most of Q1 is contract work, so maybe late in Q1 I can invest some time in that. But now let me talk about the year more broadly and a couple specific focal points. After 2020, when I was focused on, okay, let me just build an audience, clearly that didn't work out because there's so much more competition in this space now. In 2021, I want to get a bit more laser focused. I want to pick some kind of moonshot goals that I can really target and work towards. And so here are the two areas that I'm targeting for 2021. The first is institutional education, and the second is professional productivity. Institutional education and professional productivity. So institutional education is high schools, community colleges, universities. I think that if we can get Flutter adopted in schools, and I don't really care how many at the beginning, if we can get any high school interest, community college interest, university interest in using Flutter in the curriculum, I think that would be a game changer for Flutter. I mentioned this a little bit back in December when I did a panel with some other Flutter developers for Bitrise. I said, Dart and Flutter could actually be a great basis for an entire computer science curriculum. Of course, that would be a huge change. None of these schools are going to throw out all of their existing languages and switch their curriculum. But what if we could get like 1 or 2 courses to use Dart and or Flutter? What if we could get a creative programming course in a high school or a digital art and science course in a university to use Dart and Flutter? Once you're in, you can prove the viability of those things from an educational standpoint, and then they can spread. And then other courses, classes, instructors can adopt them. But you got to get through the door. I think that would be a game changer. I think Adobe has already proven, and I mentioned this before as well, I think Adobe has already proven that if you can get a foothold in the education system, there will be a natural induction into the professional world. That if a bunch of people coming out of the university system are already excellent Flutter developers, there are going to be a lot of startups, a lot of agencies, a lot of companies out there that are going to say, well, we can hire you and have you immediately contribute if we're willing to develop with Flutter, or we can pay to retrain you on one of these less effective technologies, and then we're wasting money in every way. The incentives build for the adoption of Flutter. And again, this is only because I truly believe that Flutter is a superior option to traditional Android, traditional iOS, traditional web, traditional desktop. Flutter is, in my opinion, a UI and creativity revolution for the better, and that's why I'm so interested in finding these ways to incentivize adoption. Within that overarching goal of institutional education, let me tell you what I think I'm going to do early in 2021 to help out with that effort. I'm going to port processing to Flutter. Some of you might be familiar with processing, some of you maybe not. I'll actually do a dedicated video on this, but processing is a tool. It's a set of APIs and an IDE, a code editor, designed for creative programming. It makes it very easy to paint pixels in all sorts of different ways, in 2D, in 3D, with primitive shapes, primitive colors, but also images and textures. And there's even audio support in there as well. It allows you to very quickly manipulate the canvas in whatever way you want. This has made processing very effective for graphics education, for people who are just learning how to do visual and audio programming. it also has some use for kind of art installation kind of work. You can do projection works. You can kind of prototype any individual project with processing, but it's not really used. Nobody ships production apps built with processing. Processing is where you explore. It's where you create, but then at some point you have to learn some other set of technologies like Android, iOS, or web for a product that you send to customers. But the reason I'm interested in porting processing over to Flutter, and what I mean when I say that is implement APIs that look very similar to processing, but in Flutter instead. The reason that's an interesting idea to me is because I know that processing is used heavily in education. There are high school courses, community college courses, university courses out there that use processing for this purpose. They use processing to introduce new programmers to graphics programming. Now imagine that there were a package that allows you to do all of those same things, but with Flutter. You literally don't have to change your curriculum. You just take out traditional processing and you put in the Flutter version of processing or the Flutter take on processing. Costs nothing. That's a no-risk drop-in replacement, and now Dart and Flutter are in the curriculum. And by the way, if you're curious, the language for processing is Java. Although there's P5.js, which is essentially a JavaScript browser version of processing. But the traditional tool, the language, is Java. And then there are a bunch of APIs written in Java that processing gives you that you can use in the processing editor. So that's a concrete step that I'm going to take at some point here in Q1. I'm going to start that process. And also what I'm going to do is as I port it, I'll probably film myself doing the port. So I will implement the Flutter version of processing in a series of videos, and I'll post those to the channel. So it's kind of two birds with one stone. I can make Flutter useful for education, but also you can get some more live coding content for those of you that want to see it. And not just in this time around, it won't just be how do we create some visual effect. It will be like, here is a project goal. How should we think about it? How should we approach it? How should we break down the problem? How should we design the APIs? How should we test the capability? I mean, it'll be a full-fledged open source project that I'll be working on in those videos. And so that might be of interest to some of you. Now, along those lines, if you are an instructor or a teacher and you're interested in using this, please reach out to me and let's see what we can figure out. If you know any instructors or teachers that might be interested in adopting a Flutter version of processing, again, have them reach out. Let's see what we can figure out. And I've mentioned a few times about the nature of this as a business for me, my ability to be able to do this professionally. If the open source stuff is of value to you, if you really want to help promote the development of a processing port or other open source work, I do have a donation platform. If you go to donate.superdeclarative.com, you can essentially donate to all of my open source efforts, whether that's writing code or writing blog posts or creating videos. All the free stuff that I do, it's obviously not free for me. And so if you get value from it, if you enjoy it, if you want to promote it, you might consider donating to help make that possible. Of course, if you're in high school or college, just you focus on you, go get your career off the ground. But those of you who are enjoying a great career and you just want to promote the continuation of free videos, free code, free blog posts, you might consider donating to make that possible. Now let's talk about the second area that I'm focused on this year, and that's professional productivity. So here's the thing about professional Flutter development. There seem to be a lot of developers out there, a lot of Flutter developers, who are struggling with the fundamentals of building applications with Flutter. And I don't think that these struggles are about Flutter. I think these struggles are about developers that don't really know how to think about solving app problems to begin with, and therefore they can't reason their way through how to do it with Flutter. Part of this problem, I think, is that in the app development world, many of us have gotten used to this notion of just following what someone says. And so if there's a Medium post that tells you how to solve something, if there's a video that tells you how to solve something, you just kind of copy and paste the code, but you don't think about it. You don't rationalize why you should do that or shouldn't do it or what have you. And so then you go to something like Flutter. Well, Flutter's all new. So all of those instructions for what to do, they don't exist yet. And then you're stuck because you never really learned the skill to rationalize. And so I'm going to both help with that situation and make the problem worse at the same time, I think. I'm going to start a blog or maybe a website of some sort, whether it's a blog or something similar, where I'm going to start putting out material for how I would recommend dealing with common application development issues in professional applications. So up to this point, I've been very focused on the user interface because at the end of the day, Flutter is a user interface toolkit. It is not an application framework. The stuff that you do in Dart code outside of your widget tree isn't about Flutter. That's just about your application. That's about networking. That's about data caches. That's about I/O in general or dealing with device sensors. That's not Flutter. Yes, the information flows in and out of your widget tree, and that part is Flutter related, but the rest of it isn't about Flutter. It's about fundamental software engineering practices. I'm going to try to start addressing some of those things in a blog or a website more broadly. I might talk about how to think about navigation. Now, there is a navigator in Flutter. It is related to Flutter, but still how you think about navigation needs to go beyond your user interface because it has implications for things like deep links on iOS and Android. It has implications for URLs on the web. So navigation, it goes beyond just the user interface. You need to think a little bit more about your app. I may also talk more about some project structure details. How should you or how might you break down the behavior in your application? What does it mean to have encapsulation boundaries? Why does that matter? In fact, that also takes me back to the podcast. In the podcast, not only do I want to bring on Flutter developers, but I actually would like to bring on some software developers from outside the application space. One thing that I've noticed over the years is that app developers love to associate with app developers. They go to conferences that are all about app development. There are so many experiences from outside the app world, meaning people who work on server-side systems, whether they're little monolithic systems or distributed enterprise systems. There's a whole world out there outside of Android, iOS, and web. Those developers have to solve problems too. There's not a lot of cross-pollination. A lot of the books that I've read on software development come from those people that are largely outside the application space. These are people who talk about and write about software engineering as an overall discipline rather than just from an app development standpoint. I think there are things to learn from that side. I think we should ingest that information. We should bring it into the app development side of things, and we should make sure that we're all learning from each other and we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Not only would I like to bring that into the podcast, but hopefully this blog will bring in some of that thinking as well. The blog will essentially then do two things. It will have code examples for how to do certain things, but it will also come with a clear rationalization for why you might want to do it. And my hope is that some of you will thoroughly read both parts. If you take just the code, eventually you're going to be back in the same situation of not knowing what to do. But if you read the rationalization, then next time you can solve your own problems. And that's really what we're going for here, is to teach a man to fish, not just throw fish at your face. And also, I haven't told him yet, but I might draft my friend Simon Lightfoot to help out with that blog. So it'll be a surprise when he suddenly has that responsibility. Now, in the world of professional productivity, Again, I already do corporate training. So if your team is looking to get started with Flutter, if you'd like to go through a multi-day remote training, just go to hotreload.io, send us a message, let us know you're interested. The way that training works is that myself and a member of the Very Good Ventures team will facilitate a multi-day training, and that's a combination of video lectures as well as live workshops. So there are a bunch of exercises for every video that we'll go through in real time, and we, the facilitators, will be there to answer your questions, help you understand the material, and just make sure that all of the information is settling in and that your team is ready to go with Flutter. So again, if you're part of a corporate team with as few as 3 people, but a corporate team of 3 or more people, go to hotreload.io and let us know you're interested in the training. Now, for those of you who are operating on an individual basis, if you would like some advice on how to approach a problem, if you're not sure how to think about something in Flutter, I also offer one-on-one hourly consulting. You can go to consulting.superdeclarative.com. You can schedule an hour with me on my calendar, and we'll essentially spend an hour together talking about whatever you want. This is mostly about you and your agenda and your needs. But if you have some questions you want to run by me, or if you'd like for me to review some code, or if you have some problem you're not sure how to start it, I might be able to help. We can just talk for an hour and see if I can help move you forward in whatever you're dealing with. I've done a number of these consultations. In those cases, I kind of helped these developers figure out how to organize their code, how to structure things, how to break things apart so they're more manageable, more testable. But whatever it is, if you have something that is worth an hour of our time together that you want to work through, I'll show up, we'll spend that time together, we'll see what we can do. That's, compared to the training, this is a relatively low-cost option that we can do one-on-one. So even if you're not a part of a team and even if you don't have the budget for training, I can still help you out. My goal on the professional productivity part is about making sure that the teams that choose to adopt Flutter get the experience that they're hoping to get. Because I'll go back to my earlier statement. If Flutter developers write garbage code, and if adopting Flutter is utter chaos, if teams come in, if 10 different people learn it 10 different ways with 10 different expectations, it's going to be a huge mess. And if it's a huge mess, then people start regretting the adoption of Flutter. But none of this was really Flutter's fault. It was all of the context around it. I'm trying to help even those things out as much as possible. I'm trying to be an antidote to the chaos within the corporate and professional areas of Flutter. With that said, to recap, for most of Q1 of 2021, I'm going to be working on contracts. I'll put out a couple Flutter challenges, probably in Q1 or maybe one in Q1, one in Q2. I will look into starting a podcast, but I'd love to hear from all of you about that. From your perspective, what is it that we're missing on this channel? What is it that isn't engaging people? Why aren't we reaching tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of developers? You may have perspectives on that didn't even occur to me. So I welcome your comments on that. Also, I plan to port processing to Flutter. This is my effort to help get it into education. I'll say again, if you know anyone that would like to use a Flutter version of processing in their formal education course or classes, please feel free to connect us. That'd be great. I also plan to publish a blog that looks at how to solve typical but important professional app concerns that maybe are not specific to Flutter and Flutter UIs. So that's what's on my mind right now for 2021. I might do another video like this at the beginning of Q2 to adjust plans accordingly. But with that, thank you very much for tuning in and for watching. Welcome to 2021. Have a great 2021, and I'll see you next time.